Hello, welcome back to the podcast, everyone.
What's up?
How's it going, Derek?
I'm good. How are you, Matt?
Doing well.
Sweet.
We today we are going to settle the ever-present debate on how long a sermon should be,
Okay, let's do it.
and then we're going to be talking about self-denial and some things along those lines.
Sounds
Ready
great.
to dig in?
Let's jump in.
Okay, this first one, I wasn't sure if it was a troll or not.
Right.
I'm not going to name names on the podcast, but I was like, someone's just trying to get Derek riled up. Is there a time?
Maybe Nathaniel asked the question.
Yeah, I don't think so.
No,
Definitely
it
not
wasn't it.
Nathaniel. He'd be putting in the other. He'd be like, "Why are the sermons so short?
Right.
Like, can't we go for 2 hours?"
Seriously.
Okay. So is there a time limit in sermons? And then this person noticed that there's a red countdown clock on the back wall
Yep.
and said, but we always go way over. Why is that?
Yeah.
And then they were wondering if the sermon should be boxed in. I think that's what they were trying to say.
Yeah. There was a
So,
little typo or something in there.
sure.
So the first question, is there a time limit? So we kind of shoot for anywhere from 35. Like what we would love to do is shoot for anywhere from 35 to 40 minutes.
Yeah.
That would be just utterly sweet with regard to that. I think, on average, we're probably closer to like 45 to 50
Sure.
on many weeks. And, we're definitely, I think we're working, both Nathaniel and I are both working to trend towards more concise sermons and things like that. But we were even having a conversation about this question yesterday. One of the things that I think Nathaniel and I both feel very acutely, well, two things actually. One is that I think because of the day and age in which we live, there are two kind of factors that as a preacher, you always have to try to balance and even speak to. One is the fact that there's an increasing amount of biblical illiteracy in our culture today, and part of that is just due to kind of context or historical distance between how life goes now and how life worked and operated then. Undoubtedly, there's tons of similarities, and that's what we're always trying to draw out. But we're trying to many times show why the text, even when it says exactly what it says, why that text is still relevant to today.
Sure.
And so that takes a little bit of explaining. So there's stuff oftentimes just embedded within the text itself that our typical Western mindsets just don't resonate with or get. So like as an example, when we were going through Genesis, whether it's Genesis 1 or Genesis 8 and the flood narrative or Genesis 11 and the Tower of Babel, like our minds automatically start asking a certain set of questions because we're Westerners living in the 21st century.
Yeah.
And so our minds race to things like chronology, aspects of history, science, questions
Sure.
like that. And it's okay to ask those questions. But again, even as we talked about a few weeks ago on the podcast, that's not always what the scripture is actually seeking to answer.
Yeah.
And so we have to address those things because we know that those questions are in people's minds. But then we actually have to try to then orient people's minds and hearts towards, but yeah, what's the text really trying to deal with, and why is it relevant to my life today? And so again, as a communicator, you can therefore imagine that's going to take a little bit of time.
Yeah.
So again, some of it is just inherent within what's going on in Scripture in that day and age, and then again, some of it is just inherent with what's going on in our own day. And trying to connect those two things, again, it just takes time. So again, what would be the ideal amount of time? We're shooting for 35 to 40 minutes, but usually we end up going over a little bit. But again, if you have been paying attention to the clock in the back of the room, and now anybody who listens to the podcast is gonna turn around
I know.
and be distracted by it.
I told Nathaniel I think we should put blinders on it.
Seriously,
So
well,
people like a stoplight.
yeah, and I actually wonder if maybe we should just turn it off and we can use just a clock on the back wall.
You guys weren't the ones who asked to put it up.
Right.
There was production team members
Right.
who just one day you're up there preaching, all of a sudden there's this clock.
Right.
And then the next day it starts turning red when you hit a
Right.
certain point, which
Right. Which again, that's okay. But like just FYI, a lot of times if you turn around, if you have seen that it's over by like 23 or 24 minutes, sometimes that's not just the inclusion of how long we went as preachers. It actually included the last song, any announcements or final comments, the benediction. And sometimes it doesn't even get turned off at the end of the worship service. Like it's still counting. So
well, I think the idea
anyway.
is it's meant to be a tool for you,
Right.
right? So like once the sermon's done anyways, they might not turn it off because they're like, it's not for so other people can see at the end what the timestamp was. It was
Right.
to help you guys stay on track for whatnot.
Right. Yeah. So anyway, that's what we're shooting for.
Let me
It's
ask you
35
this.
to 40. Yeah.
I'm in the camp of I'm like, oh yeah, 35-minute sermon, that sounds nice. It sounds like a nice condensed amount of time. Do I need to check myself and kind of like there's other churches. My mom she was going to a church for a little bit in Framingham, and I think it was like some Latin American church, and they were meeting all day, right? Like it was they were
Totally.
there for the day.
Yeah.
And if you go other places in the world, these they'll apart from maybe not the sermons that long, but like they're meeting for hours and hours and hours.
Yeah.
And then here we are, and we're like, okay, 45 minutes. It's a little, this doesn't really fit in with my attention span. Can we just cut this down
Right.
to make this a more consumeristic kind of product? Are we getting am I getting, as New Englanders, I understand it, like
Sure.
where we are. But Nathaniel made this point. We were talking before the podcast, and he said the one comment he wanted to make was that, in this area, preaching for 35 minutes is probably like the shortest amount of time in all of history in any area of the globe that anyone's been preaching on things.
Sure.
So what do you think there? Like, should you guys be pushing back and saying like, no, like, this isn't just some prepackaged product?
Right. Well, yeah, I think, the way that I would almost try to address it, even when I think about other preachers that I listen to on a regular basis, it's almost like rather than setting an amount of time and saying, every sermon needs to be 35 minutes or however long, trying to figure out how long would the text actually demand that I go within reason. Again, I think if you're taking a pretty large and sizable chunk of text, like it's probably going to be a slightly longer sermon. If it's loaded with theological context, either you're going to have to preach a little bit longer, or maybe you need to do a couple of sermons.
Yeah, you've been in Genesis and then Revelation,
right?
It's like those aren't like gloss over. Oh, light. There's not much theological depth here. It's like no, there's a lot going on.
Yeah, and so I think rather than maybe coming in with the preconceived notion of like every sermon needs to be a set amount of time, allow the text itself to kind of dictate a little bit more, what things need to be described, defined, applied, recognizing the fact though that even in a comment like that, it's like you can come back to the same passage a million different times and still have more to mind.
Yeah.
Right. So you can't just keep going and keep going and keep going and in the same sermon, right? Like you have to give people the opportunity to digest and reflect and things like that. So I think there does have to be a little bit of a balance, but I don't think that necessarily our attention span is always the best test or kind of ruler by which we measure how long things go.
Yeah.
You think about pretty much everything, whether it's a Twitter feed or a TikTok video or whatever, right? You've got these things that are constantly coming to us in bite-sized chunks, and that's just arguably not the best way to learn. And actually what we're doing in that a lot of times is we're actually conditioning ourselves in a direction that oftentimes isn't necessarily helpful. And I would also just say that, it's really difficult when like for us as church leaders, when we're thinking about the formation that we as just human beings are getting in our 24/7 experience, outside of the church gathered, versus the amount of time that we're actually giving to being reformed or transformed by
Yeah.
the renewing of our minds when we're actually together as God's people. And I do think there's some importance to that. I'm not saying that our services should go 2 hours or 3 hours or anything like that. And I do think that there are just some cultural expectations that they're not necessarily right or wrong. It's like I've been to church in Africa and it lasted 3 hours.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's wrong. I don't also think that it's right. I don't think that it's right that our worship services are anywhere from an hour to an hour and 25 minutes. I don't think that that's more moral or immoral. But there are just realities that I think we have to work within and be wise about. And so we're just trying to do the best that we can in regard to that.
Sounds good.
So,
Okay. Cool.
yeah.
All right, let's move on to the second question, which I think's a great question.
Yeah.
How do I live a life of self-denial and self-giving without being taken advantage of? And they go on to ask, how do I know when it's appropriate to ask for things I need? My motives are never perfect, and self-deception is always a threat. That's here. Do you want to break this down into two parts, or how do you want to do this?
Yeah, I feel like there are kind of two different questions there, and even though there are three parts to the comment, right? Because the last bit I think is actually just a great place to start.
Okay.
Because at least in one sense, we have to always recognize the fact that whether we're being trying to adopt the attitude of self-denial and serving other people, or if we're asking for the things that we need, self-deception is always going to be close at hand. And so I just want to, first of all, applaud whoever's asking the question for being self-aware enough and having an understanding of who we are as human beings, fallen human beings, that we understand we're never going to get this exactly right. So just that's a constant recognition that we need to embrace. Nevertheless, we're still invited into a lifestyle and a posture of self-denial, and then also asking other people for help when we need it.
Yeah.
And I think these comments and the questions are real questions. They're exactly where we live, because breaking it into the two questions in and of themselves, like, there are going to be times where you're trying to live in a lifestyle of self-denial. You're just trying to live in the way of Jesus. And you are going to be taken advantage of. And I think that in terms of like the specific question, how do you do it? I don't know that you can. I don't know that you can actually live a life of self-denial and protect yourself always and forever from being taken advantage of. Like, I think just, and I'll try to maybe use some biblical text to demonstrate this, but I think if you are going to embrace the way of the cross, which is the way that Jesus invites us all to embrace, there will be moments where people will take advantage of that. And it actually seems like even in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus does a little bit of teaching to that degree. Like as I saw this question come in, one of the places that my mind went to is where Jesus says, if somebody takes your shirt, you give them your tunic also.
Yeah.
And part of what I think is going on in Jesus' teaching, which, by the way, just in historical context, this was a very real thing. Like, if a Roman soldier came up to a Jew, that a Jewish citizen, because Rome was oppressing Galilee and the Jerusalem or Jewish territories during that time, they could absolutely demand whatever it was that they wanted. They could come up and say, "Hey, you carry my stuff." And so Jesus says, if somebody asks you to go with them 1 mile, go with them 2. And I think that rather than, again, our intuition, a lot of times, this is another one of these moments where it takes a little bit of explanation. But our intuition is oftentimes, well, maybe I need to take Jesus really literally here. So if somebody comes and asks to borrow my jacket, I need to also give them my shirt as well. Or if somebody tells me or asks me to carry their stuff 1 mile, I literally need to carry it too. I don't think that's really the point. The point is, again, in the larger context of the Sermon on the Mount, the point is what's going on in the heart.
Yeah.
And have we been so transformed, or are we being so utterly transformed by grace that when someone makes a demand of us, rather than feeling like they are, quote, taking something from us, do we actually recognize that we have the agency still in that moment through the work of Jesus to actually give? So one of the other verses that I was thinking of when I saw this question, and just to zoom out a little bit, to reframe the question just a touch, I ask myself the question, would I say Jesus was taken advantage of? Because again, I think that, I don't know who the questioner is, but I think that we would probably argue Jesus was the most self-denying human who's
Sure.
ever lived, right?
Yeah.
Hopefully we would agree on that. Was Jesus taken advantage of? Well, on the one hand, we could absolutely say yes. He was, right? I mean, as an innocent human being, he was totally and completely maligned, rejected, unjustly punished. He was taken advantage of, if we want to describe it that way. But Jesus, in John chapter 10, he actually says, when he's describing the way that he frames his life, he actually says, no one takes my life from me, but I lay it down willingly of my own accord. And again, I wonder if now taking some of that framework and trying to apply that to Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount in our own lives, do we recognize that, again, we're not going to do it perfect, right? Because we're not Jesus. And so there will be moments where, somebody's going to demand something of me, and I'm just going to haul off and be angry at them and maybe yell and tell them no or whatever, right?
Yeah.
But could I ever be so shaped by the grace of God that I've received through Christ that I would actually be able to say, no one is taking this from me, I'm actually giving it. I'm willing, even though you're demanding my jacket, I'm willing to give you even more than you're asking. Even though you're demanding that I walk with you a mile, I'm willing to go beyond that to serve you. And again, now all of that to say, one of the things that I think there are other parts of Jesus' teaching that I think balances this, because when we're talking about self-denial, and undoubtedly we'll get more into this in future sermons as well, but Jesus is not telling us to become self-rejecting or to, in essence, begin casting ourselves as just doormats that people can walk all over.
That's what I was going to ask, is what, is it Mark 8? If anyone's to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross and follow me. It's what is that denial? What are you denying when it says deny yourself?
Yeah, so I tried to touch a little bit on this on Sunday, but I think the first thing that we're denying is ultimately we're denying the attempt to try to put ourselves in the place of God. We're denying the idea that my rights, my comfort, my convenience, my will should always and ever be done. I'm laying that idea down because I realize, even just as Jesus taught us to pray, thy kingdom come, thy will be done, or echoing the prayer that Jesus prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane, Lord, this is what I desire. I desire that you would take the cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. So us coming to grips with the fact that Jesus is actually our Lord, and he has full and complete access to demand anything from us. And as one who's following him, I have to repeatedly, daily. I think that actually in Luke's gospel, I know the word daily in that same teaching in Luke 9, the word daily is inserted. You need to daily pick up your cross and follow me. And so I think it's what we're denying is the recognition that we are not God and that we don't always know what is best. Our comforts and conveniences and desires, wills should not forever and always be sought after and achieved. But rather, we're giving up that sense of what we think, our definition of what the good life looks like. We're giving that up because Jesus says in the very next phrase, anyone who's trying to save his life is going to lose it. But anyone who loses his life for me, Jesus says. And I think those two words, for me, are the key. Like, you have to lose your life for me, and then you'll find it. You'll actually become the human that I actually created you to be, which again sounds so counterintuitive. It sounds like what Jesus is inviting us into is becoming a doormat. But again, I think that can't be, that's like the furthest thing from the truth that Jesus is asking us to do. He's asking us to surrender our self-will and the assumption that we are in the place of God. We're surrendering that thing that we tried to seize way back in Genesis 3, where we were like, yeah, I actually want to be able to define right and wrong, define good and evil, define, what is good and necessary for me in this moment. And that's a daily reorientation that we need to have happen. But one of the things that I think is inherent within this question of self-denial is, what do you do when you are being taken advantage of because of someone else's sin? Like, do you just let that go on forever and a day? And I think the answer there is, well, no. Because again, balancing even Jesus' teaching with walking the second mile or giving the shirt when somebody demands you to give them your tunic or whatever, I think is the teaching like in Matthew 18, where Jesus talks about if someone is sinning against you, you go and show them their fault. It would be inappropriate. So like boundaries, we talk a lot about boundaries today in our culture. It would be unloving on the one hand to pursue what I want all the time, to be self-seeking. It is loving to be self-denying, but it is also unloving to allow someone to repeatedly sin against me.
Yeah.
It's unloving to them. It's also unloving to me. But the heart behind which I go to that person when they're offending me, when they're taking advantage of me, is not one of, really trying to stick it to them and cram it down their throat and things like that, but rather, again, in Jesus' teaching in Matthew 18, I think you see the clear idea of you go and show your brother their fault, and if they repent, then you've won your brother back. And so I think kind of included within that going and showing the brother or sister their fault is this idea of, look, I'm coming to you honestly and humbly, wanting you to accept this gift of forgiveness that I'm holding out to you, because you took advantage of me, you hurt me, you offended me in whatever specific way it is. And the way that you lay hold of that gift, friend, is by repenting, by actually saying, oh my goodness, I actually was totally blind because I'm so self-deceived. Third comment or part of the question here. I was so self-deceived that I didn't even realize that's what I was doing. I'm so sorry. Yes, please forgive me. And I recognize that I did what was wrong. So there are boundaries that Jesus puts up. And again, he even goes on, right? Because some people are going to be so self-deceived that they're not going to pay any attention to you. They're going to try to put it back on you, right? Quit being so thin-skinned or whatever. That wasn't offensive. That wasn't hurtful. And Jesus says, if they aren't willing to repent, then you bring a friend along. Yeah. Right. And if they're still unwilling, you go a third time. Like this demonstrates this persevering grace that should, I think, be at the heart of people who are wrestling with self-denial in the way of Jesus. But there's this persevering, gracious heart, gracious attitude. It's not the adage, though, that maybe we're so common to quote to ourselves of like, yeah, if you take advantage of me once, shame on you. But if you take advantage of me twice, shame on me, right?
Yeah.
Like, again, I know that's not exactly how the adage goes. Fool me once, that's how it goes. But to just play on the adage a little bit, you're going to be taken advantage of.
Yeah.
But I think that to some degree, and this is the text that we're going to be looking at this week in Philippians 3, when you are taken advantage of, there are going to be some moments where the biggest joy that you're going to have is actually learning the fellowship of sharing in Christ's sufferings. Becoming more and more like him, even in the things that you suffer. But again, that doesn't make you a doormat.
Yeah.
You still have agency, but now you're learning at an even deeper level. You're learning in an imperfect way, but an approximating way. I think that we're learning more and more how to say, no one is taking these things from me. I'm laying these things down. But as I lay these things down, I'm also going to be receiving something from God in the midst of it.
Yeah.
There's a grace and a strength and a power that is not mine, that's alien to me, that is actually, being made more and more manifest in my life, even as I do this.
Yeah.
Again, knowing that we're not going to do it perfectly. And then getting maybe or did you want to ask a follow-up to any of that?
Well, I just have so many thoughts on that. I think the point you make about not being a doormat is so important, right? Like
Yeah.
I can picture someone in like, say an abusive relationship,
Yep.
and they're like, "No, this is my cup to bear.
Right.
Like
I should deny myself.
I
And
should, yeah,
yeah, and to be abundantly clear, no, like that's sin. It's evil that someone is perpetrating against you, and that's where Matthew 18 holds sway. But this takes it does take a ton of wisdom,
yeah."
for sure. Sorry to interrupt you.
And then I'm also, I'm thinking, yeah, on the self-denial, like when you were unpacking what the self-denial is, I was trying to formulate and put the puzzle pieces together in my head of like what that is. And when we say like deny ourselves, it feels like to me that when we say those things that you're denying within yourself, it's kind of those warped
That's right.
inclinations, right? It's
That's right.
those taking this good thing, making it an ultimate thing, right? And denying that impulse within ourselves, and denying that, and holding Christ as the ultimate thing.
Right. Yeah, I think that is a good point of clarification, Matt, that what we're denying again is that tendency to grasp onto a status that doesn't belong to us. It's the sinful parts of who we are that we're learning to deny.
Yeah.
It's the curved, bent, and broken parts of us. As Paul would refer to in various places in his writing, it's the old man that
Yeah.
we're learning to deny.
It's not like, oh, you're out to dinner and your wife wants to order dessert and there's a wonderful thing, and you're like, no, we are called to deny ourselves. We
That's
can't
right.
enjoy that chocolate
That's right.
brownie and whatnot together.
Yeah, enjoy the chocolate brownie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Everything in moderation, as Paul would say elsewhere, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah,
And then the last thing I was thinking about was the threat of taking. This is kind of more similar to the first thing that I was saying. The threat of like taking the self denial aspect and taking that as, if I'm suffering, then it's almost looking at it not from like a legalistic perspective, but like if I'm suffering, then that is good, and kind of putting yourself in positions to be taken advantage of, or kind of being overly abusive towards yourself in that regard of like just giving everything to your own detriment.
yeah, it becomes masochistic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that? Like,
Yeah, I mean, I think that, there arguably were expressions of that at various parts of church history. Right. There were certainly the aesthetics that went out and lived in the desert. There are stories of people who lived on poles 30 feet up in the air,
Yeah.
and didn't actually have adequate clothing, and that was the way that they thought somehow they were meriting standing
Yeah.
with the Lord. And again, God never calls us to that. That's actually such an extreme form. I would actually say that's not self-denial. That moves into the place of self-repudiation, self-loathing, almost self-destruction, which is not God's will. For those that He created good and in His image. And so I think, again, we do have to be very, very careful that our understanding of self-denial doesn't slide into that. And one of the ways maybe to think about this is oftentimes when people think about spiritual disciplines and aspects, expressions of how we can be made more like Jesus, they talk about two different categories. They say that there are some disciplines of withdrawal, or disciplines of, quote, abstinence in some senses. So solitude, fasting. Solitude is a form of self-denial. Silence would be a form of self-denial. Fasting would be a form of self-denial. But then you have to balance that with disciplines of engagement. Disciplines of, and I mean, think about this, like in the scriptures, we see people commanded to feast.
Yeah.
Right? So we have to balance the fasting and the feasting.
Yeah.
You can't just feast all the time, nor can you always fast. You can't always be living in solitude and isolation. You also need to live in community, but you can't always live in community. There are times where you need to pull away and let God, challenge you, speak to you, all of those things. And I would just say that part and parcel to this whole conversation about self-denial is recognizing that self-denial is kind of a blanket or umbrella term for different spiritual disciplines that would fall under that category of disciplines of withdrawal. But there also will be points in time where Jesus is going to invite you into disciplines of engagement or celebration, right? Like the dessert time with your wife that you were describing. I mean, in a way, that seems like such a silly example, but I think it's exactly what we're talking about. There may be a season of life where you're like, you know what? I feel like God is calling me for various reasons to fast from certain things. So you don't eat dessert, right?
Yeah.
And you don't eat a lot of other things, or you're fasting from social media or whatever. But then there's also going to be a point in time where you re-engage in the midst of that, and you feast and you celebrate. So anyway, those are just a few more thoughts as I think about it, because Jesus does not want us to move into some kind of masochistic, I'm earning my way or meriting my way into good standing with God through different forms of self-denial.
Sure.
That's not the point.
Yeah.
So
well said. Were you moving into another part of this question?
I was going to go into the second part of the question, but if you have more follow-up. So the next part of the question of like, how do I ask for the things that I need? Is that exactly how it's phrased?
They say, how do I know when it's appropriate to ask for things I need?
Yeah. Another great question. And I think implicit within the question itself is another expression of self-awareness, right? Like, you will have needs. God has created us with limits, and those limits are good. And those limits are ones that we shouldn't try to, constantly run beyond in our own strength. There will be times where we are called to live beyond limits in God's strength. But I think asking other people for help is clearly something that we need to do. Think about even Philippians 2. When I read this part of the question, I was thinking about Paul's description in Philippians 2 when he says, "Let this attitude be in you that was also in Christ Jesus." And he goes on to talk about Jesus as self-emptying. But right before that, Paul talks a little bit about self-denial. He says, hey, if you have any comfort from the love that Christ gives you, if you're experiencing the fellowship of the Holy Spirit, then make my joy complete by being of the same mind and having the same love. And then he says, but don't look just after your own interests. Look also after the interests of others. So hopefully we've already talked about how can we look after the interests of others. We talked about self-denial, but inherent within that verse, Paul says that we're going to have needs, right? there are going to be, quote, interests of our own that we have. And Paul says, don't just look after your own interests, also look after the interests of others. But he also doesn't say at any point here, hey, never look after your own interests. Um, you should always just be able and willing to live beyond your own limits. So how do we balance that? How do we take care of it? So one of the things that I was thinking of with regard to this, it actually comes again from some of Jesus's teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, where he says, ask, seek, knock, ask and it will be open, or ask and you will receive, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be opened. One of the interesting things about that part of the passage in Matthew 7 is it seems like Jesus is actually arguing from the lesser kinds of relationship to the greater. So I don't know if you've ever noticed, but, and again, I know we taught through the Sermon on the Mount last spring, but part of what seems to be going on there is Jesus moves from the lesser relationship, that is human relationships, then into the greater relationship with God. So he says, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be open to you. And then he moves on and he basically says, this is also the way that it works in relationship with the Father in prayer. But the first part, and I think that oftentimes when we think about ask, seek, and knock, we automatically run to prayer.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with that, but if you look at the context, Jesus also seems to be talking about human relationships.
Interesting.
Because again, he uses similar teaching like in Luke's gospel, similar phrasing being used. But in Luke's gospel, he says, which of you, if you had a friend and you went to him at night and you knocked on his door, which of you has a friend that would actually send you away empty-handed if you had a real need?
Yeah.
Right. So how do we ask for our need? Like we ask, like we do ask. We recognize that there will be moments when we do have needs, and we actually ask other people. But some other things, and this is just maybe as I've reflected on certain moments in my life, and even the way that I've gone about asking at times, I realized that sometimes there's something a little bit more than just asking that's going on. It's more like I'm demanding. And I see this in my relationship with God. I also see it in my relationship with others. And kind of the way that this would look, let's say in prayer, I go to God asking him for, a certain kind of provision, and it doesn't come. And then I find myself getting really frustrated and angry. So at that point, I begin to have to ask myself, was I really asking?
Yeah, it's a good litmus test.
Yeah, or was I demanding
Yeah.
in that moment? Because if I was demanding, then actually what I'm doing, going back to some of what we talked about earlier, is I'm actually putting my will above God's. I'm kind of taking that place of, Lord, I really think I know what's best for me right now, and you don't.
Yeah.
And the heart that needs to be present within prayer, again, is, Lord, not my will, but your will be done.
Yeah.
Your kingdom come, your will be done. Even in my life, start with me. And so I'm just asking here. And so, Lord, I'm going to receive everything. And I'm not saying I do a great job at this.
Sure.
I've got plenty to learn and a long way to go, God knows, in regard to this. But when I'm being honest and I realize I'm really frustrated, that God is holding out on me or being slow to answer or whatever, I realize I'm not asking, I'm demanding. And the same can sometimes be true of of my relationship with other people.
Sure.
So there may be a moment where I genuinely have a need, right? And I need somebody to come to my aid to help me, let's say it's something like move a couch or something
Sure.
like that. Again, if I'm genuinely asking, I might be a little disappointed if you say no. Like, let's say I call you, Matt, and I'm like, hey, I really need you to help me move my couch. And you're like, I can't, I've got another commitment right now. If I fly off the handle and,
Yeah.
just go off on you, you're such a horrible friend or something like that, I'm actually making a demand. I'm not asking
Sure.
in that moment. I'm demanding.
Yeah.
If I'm genuinely asking, I don't have to push. and I don't have to make the demand. Like, you're free to say, Derek, I really can't. I would love to do it. Or, hey, could I do it an hour later than you were planning because I can't come over at that time that you're thinking.
Yeah.
And I have to be free to kind of say, yes, okay, yeah, that'll work. Then I know I'm actually asking. But again, there are some moments where when I'm asking, there's something else that's actually going on at a deeper level. And maybe what I've done is, again, I've elevated my will, my desire, my need. I've elevated it to such a place that it has become an ultimate thing again. And so all of a sudden, to this second question in particular, I'm not asking.
Yeah.
I'm making a demand.
Can I add to that?
Yeah, go for it.
It reminds me of and there was someone in my family where we've called them out because they were doing. I'm not talking my immediate family, the expanded family.
Sure.
It wasn't Katie. Okay, people were like, your family. Who are
Katie's
you
in the
your
clear.
kids or where like they would do the math on things and say
Right.
like they would have and my family is very close and we can talk about these things.
Sure.
They would have the expectation of if they asked for something,
Right.
they would have an expectation of, well, you would do this because of all these other areas where I've helped you and this types of things.
Kind of
And
an I scratch your back, you scratch mine.
yeah,
kinda.
yeah, and just that expectation of yeah, or doing the math behind it,
Right.
right? Like, well, I've earned 8 points here, so now when I ask for things, I have 8 points worth of asking,
Right.
where it's going to come back, and we're like, that's not those. If that's true, then anything you've done, those things were all just selfishly you building your brownie points, right? Like
Right.
they actually selfless,
Right.
out of love for that person,
Right.
you know?
So it's awesome that you bring that up. This last weekend I had the privilege of doing some friend's wedding, and the text that they had chosen for the sermon was actually 1 Peter 4:8-10.
Okay.
And the text, I won't be able to just rattle it off exactly from memory, but it essentially says, you need to love one another with just a selfless love, because love covers a multitude of sins. I want you to also practice hospitality without grumbling. And then I want you to serve one another out of the gifts that God has given you. And in the little sermonette that I was doing, the second point that I was making when the text talks about this idea of practicing hospitality without grumbling, it's a really interesting Greek phrase. Literally, the Greek says, I want you to love the stranger without grumbling. And again, the text, 1 Peter 4:8-10, isn't specifically talking about marriage. It's just talking about relationships in general.
Yeah.
But certainly it applies to marriage. But one of the things that I just mentioned is that, like, even in our relationships, and again, I know it wasn't Katie,
Yeah.
so but I'm going to get
Yeah.
to an illustration that I used that I think speaks exactly to what you were just describing. Even in marriage, one of the ways that we sometimes grumble against our spouse rather than serving them with hospitality, without grumbling, is that we actually keep score.
Yeah.
Keeping score doesn't seem like a form of grumbling, but it is.
Yeah.
And so I read a while back, I read an article. It was in the New York Times. It was entitled, "Honey, I Swept the Floor." You can actually find it. And it was about a couple that was actually keeping score. And so both of them, they were both working, and especially once kids entered the picture, they were constantly trying to like one up each other. It was like, oh, I had a really busy day at work, and then I came home and I swept the floor, and then I came home and emptied the dishwasher and
Yeah.
did the laundry and all these other things. And what ended up happening as I was reading this, not only was I convicted, because I have the tendency sometimes
Sure.
to do that. And so again, I'm not asking in that situation. I'm kind of like, yeah, I've got a few brownie points in the bank, and I'd like to cash that in right
Sure.
now. But essentially, kind of the way that you see this working, if you begin accounting, storing up credits, so to speak,
Yeah.
and expecting some kind of return, what ends up happening is you move into, rather than into a posture of hospitality and service, of another person, you move into a position of entitlement.
Mm.
Or expectation was the word that you used. I'm expecting that somebody else is going to reciprocate, right?
Yeah.
So I'm entitled to some reciprocation here. But then when that expectation, and invariably it will be disappointed.
For sure.
When that happens, then you move into resentment.
Mm.
And then what happens after resentment takes hold, you just blow up, right? Because there's nothing you can do. Once you've thought, okay, I've got a lot of credits in the bank and now I want to cash some of those in. It didn't happen. The other person didn't serve me. Now I resent them. And at some point I'm going to pop. I'm going to explode. So in those moments, I'm not asking,
Yeah.
right? I'm demanding. And so I think we have to be really careful with that. So how do we ask? How do we know, how to ask? Again, I think we do it with humility. We do it with that expression of recognition of like, hey, if you can't do this right now, that's okay. I might be disappointed, but at the end of the day, it's a genuine ask. You might not be able to come over and help me move my
Yeah.
couch, right? Or God may not be willing to give us what it is that we feel like we need at that moment, and that's okay. Because again, I'm coming with a posture of humility, of self denial in the midst of this. But I'm willing to ask because I recognize I'm not capable of doing it all. Taking
Yeah.
care of everything. Like I have limits.
Yeah.
So yeah, that would be. It's a long answer
Yeah.
to a short question, but I think there's a lot to it.
Yeah. I want to not to go too far down the tangent of what we're talking about on but I did see a study about they took people in group projects. This is about the scorekeeping I'm talking about.
Yeah, yeah.
They took people in group projects and they said, what percent did you attribute towards the group project, right? And if you take the 5 people in the group and you add up their scores, it's always above 100%. So everyone always over attributes their contribution towards something.
That's
But
good.
you could take that same thing and apply it to your marriage.
Totally
Like
true.
you need to be aware that subconsciously you're probably over attributing your impact or your contribution towards
Right.
like doing things, and
a good
because
word.
it's innate within us to, but it's actually true on the negative end of things too. If there's something, an issue or whatnot, and they say how much you think this because of your responsibility, people over attribute it to themselves. Basically, we think we're more important than we are.
Right.
Okay, we
Yeah.
think, and it's just good. I've taken that just as a mental footnote for in my
Right.
life, in my marriage, to say, okay, you think you did all this stuff here. It's like, just remember, you're probably overinflating
That's a
what
good
that is
word,
there.
Matt. I love that illustration. That may actually come out in a sermon
Go
sometime
for
soon.
it.
So
Go for it. I'm sure you could find the study.
I definitely will look it up.
I do want to just ask one final thing about the about asking for help.
Yeah.
It's something that I've become better at. But it's difficult often. And I
Yeah.
think for men, often it's difficult to ask for help. And probably the underlying thing there is pride, at least in my life, when I don't want to ask for help.
Yeah.
Like it's hard. Thankfully, I've never had to ask for money. Well, unless I was young. But I think of something like that where I'm like,
Yeah.
it would be very difficult for me out of my pride to not want to do that, or
Yeah.
very difficult to ask for help in a lot of ways. Like, what do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah. I do think that it a lot of times our unwillingness to ask for help does come down to pride, or again, an overinflated sense of self and what I should be capable of. And, I mean, whether it's men or women, in our culture, a lot of times what is championed is that person who can, pull himself or herself up by their bootstraps and, make something of themselves. They're a self-made woman or self-made man. They don't have to ask for help. And again, I would just say, first and foremost, like that is the furthest thing from the way that human beings are described all throughout Scripture, even pre-sin, right? So like go all the way back to Genesis. In Genesis 2, it was not good for man to be alone,
Yeah.
right? There needed to be a helper suitable for him. And so the idea of or the need for human relationships is like hardwired into who we are.
Yeah.
We need, even to use the language of the text, we need help,
That's great.
right? And so I think just even starting there, like don't think that limits and the need to ask for help comes just because sin is in the world. It existed prior to sin. It was just that our self-deception wasn't mixed in there,
Sure.
right? And our selfishness and the demands and all those other things weren't present before sin. We would have been able to ask for help purely. But the other passage that it makes me kind of think of is in the early days of the church in Acts 4 and 5, when the people were just being generous with one another. And the sense that you get, I think, if you read Acts 4 and 5, is that there were some people who were like, you know what, God has blessed us abundantly, and we're able to give out of our generosity right now. And there were other people who were coming and saying, we're falling on hard times right now, and we actually have great need. Is there anything that you can do to help? And people were like, yes. And so I think the church is probably one of the places, it should be the place, to which the world actually could look and just be astounded. It even says in the book of Acts, that's one of the things that was most attractive about the church. That's one of the reasons why daily there were people being added to their number.
Yeah.
Because people were just like, this is such a countercultural reality. They have the freedom to ask for help.
Yeah.
and people are actually supplying their need, you know?
Yeah.
And so
Out of joy.
Yeah. Out of joy. And again, not feeling like I'm superior if I'm able to help meet the needs of others, and not feeling like, oh, I'm somehow inferior if I actually have to be the one who's asking for help.
Mm-hmm.
So again, even the image of God and what the church ought to be can, I think, hopefully affect or help some of our perspective on that, to alleviate some of the fear if we need to go ask for help.
Yeah.
So those are some of the things that I think about.
Awesome. Any other thoughts on this topic at all, or?
I mean, we could talk about them forever, but
I know.
that's, if people only want a 30-minute sermon, we've gone over, I'm assuming. So
Yeah, probably. Okay. All right. Well, that's it for this week then. We are Center Grace Church here in Beverly. This is Pastor Derek Baker. And
Hey, everybody.
we meet Sunday, 10:15. Come and join us.
Good to see you guys,
Yeah.
or be with you virtually. Podcast.
Virtually. All right.
See
Take
you next
care.
week.
Bye.